Before we start today's video, we just want to bring you a word from our sponsor, The Ridge. I don't know what you've heard or read in the news lately, but it sounds like delivery times around the holidays are going to be crazy. So why not get a jump on your shopping right now? For example, you could get the special people in your life something that they could use for the rest of their life, like a Ridge wallet. Ridge wallets are durable and made from strong material like aluminum, titanium, carbon fiber, and they even have 18-karat gold plated. They are sleek and have a bunch of cool designs. Plus, they come with a lifetime warranty. The Ridge has so much more than wallets. They also have awesome weatherproof backpacks and duffel bags, phone cases, bottle openers, and so much more. The Ridge has a special offer for criminally listed viewers. To save 10% and get free worldwide shipping and returns, go to ridge.com/listed and use the promo code LISTED. Once again, go to ridge.com/listed and use the promo code LISTED for 10% off, plus free worldwide shipping and returns. Number 3. Ethan Couch. In June 2013, 24-year-old Brianna Mitchell was working as a chef at a private club. Just after 11 p.m., she was driving in Tarrant County, Texas, after finishing a shift at work. As she was driving, a tire on her SUV blew, and her car went to the shoulder of the road. She ended up knocking over the mailbox of the Boyles family. Eric Boyles, his 52-year-old wife, Holly, and their 21-year-old daughter, Shelby, came outside to help Mitchell. Then a 41-year-old youth minister named Brian Jennings pulled over to help as well. Jennings was on his way home from his son's graduation party. He had two boys who were in middle school in the back seat of his pickup truck. He instructed them to stay in the truck and keep their seatbelts on. Eric Boyles decided to move the mailbox into his garage. Brianna Mitchell was talking on the phone with her mother. Jennings, Holly, and Shelby were surveying the damage on Mitchell's car. Suddenly, a Ford F-350 going 74 miles per hour slammed into Mitchell's SUV. The Ford then plowed into Brianna Mitchell, Brian Jennings, Holly, and Shelby Boyles. It then struck Jennings' pickup truck where the two boys were sitting in the back. The force caused Jennings' truck to move into the road where it collided head-on with a Volkswagen Beetle. After hitting Jennings' truck, the Ford flipped into a tree. In the cab of the truck were 6 teenagers, and 2 were in the bed of the truck. None of the teenagers were wearing seatbelts. The 2 in the bed of the truck were tossed 60 feet. The driver of the Ford pickup truck, 16-year-old Ethan Couch, got out of the truck and walked away from the accident. One of the boys who was in Jennings' truck climbed out of the back window. He believes he heard Ethan say, "I only had 2 beers. I'm not going to get in trouble for this." When Ethan was arrested, it was clear he had more than 2 beers that night. His blood alcohol level was 0.24, which is more than 3 times the legal limit. Plus, he had marijuana and Valium in his system. The collisions caused a disturbing amount of damage. Ethan killed 24-year-old Brianna Mitchell, 42-year-old Brian Jennings, 52-year-old Holly Boyles, and 21-year-old Shelby Boyles. 8 other people were injured. 17-year-old Sergio Molina, who was thrown from the bed of Ethan's truck, was left paralyzed and he can only communicate through blinking. 16-year-old Ethan was charged with 4 counts of intoxication manslaughter. After the crash, a psychiatrist worked with Ethan and his family to learn more about them. Ethan Anthony Couch was born on April 11, 1994 in Tarrant County, Texas, to Fred and Tanya Couch. When Fred was 21 years old, he started his own business, Glenburn Sheet Metal, which manufactures large-scale metal roofing. The business was successful and lucrative. Fred is described as short-tempered and arrogant. He has little regard for authority. He also considers himself better than other people because he has money. In 1992, Fred was pulled over on suspicion of drinking and driving. Fred told the officer that he probably made more money in a day than the officer did in a year. When Ethan was 13, he drove himself to the private school he attended. The school called Fred and told him. Instead of being angry at Ethan, Fred was mad at the school. He said that Ethan was the best driver he knew, and the 13-year-old would be driving himself to school from now on. This is how things generally went when Ethan got into trouble at school. His parents always thought that he was the best and most talented, so nothing was ever his fault. Other times, Fred would respond by saying he would buy the school. Fred would also say it didn't matter how Ethan did in school, because eventually he'd be taking over the family business. Ethan eventually left the school at age 15 and he was placed in a homeschooling program. Fred and Tanya divorced in 2006. Fred claimed it was because Tanya was addicted to pills and she would threaten to kill herself. Tanya claimed that the marriage ended because Fred was verbally and physically abusive. She also claimed he had affairs. The police have been called to their home several times. Tanya doted over Ethan and she thought he could do no wrong. They also had an odd relationship. She called Ethan her protector. Around the age of 9, Ethan started sleeping in a bed in the same room as his mother. After Ethan's parents split up, Fred would see his son irregularly. When Fred was with Ethan, Fred didn't supervise him properly. He said he wasn't a mom. In 2003, Tanya was arrested for reckless driving after she intentionally forced another car off the road. She was fined and given probation. Fred's lack of respect for authority was passed along to Ethan. In February 2013, a police officer found 15-year-old Ethan urinating in the parking lot of a store. When the officer asked him what he was doing, Ethan said, "What does it look like I'm doing?" In the truck was a naked 14-year-old girl, plus an open can of beer and a bottle of vodka. Tanya was called to the parking lot, and she accused Ethan of sneaking out. But Ethan said he had told her he was going out. He also said he only had one beer. Even though Ethan had broken 6 laws, he was just issued a ticket for minor in consumption and minor in possession, and his mother took him home. On June 15, 2013, Ethan took a pickup truck from his dad's work and drove it home. He invited some friends over, and they had some shots. After dinner, they had more shots. Then Ethan and his friends got into his pickup truck and drove to Keller, Texas to pick up some more friends. Driving back home, Ethan saw a soccer field and did some donuts on it. Then they drove to a local Walmart. 5 boys who were with Ethan stole 3 cases of beer. Then they went back to Ethan's home and continued to drink. Later that night, the only girl at the party realized she needed a tampon, but she didn't have one, and there were none in Ethan's house. So Ethan offered to drive her to the store. Ethan didn't know the partygoers very well, and he didn't trust them to stay alone at his house, so he had everyone get into his truck. The girl was worried because Ethan was so drunk he didn't even know where he was. But a friend assured her they had seen Ethan drive like that plenty of times. So she got into the truck as well. About a quarter of a mile later, Ethan's truck collided with Brianna Mitchell's SUV. Analysis of the truck showed that Ethan didn't touch the brakes before slamming into the SUV. 2 weeks after the crash, Ethan was placed in a high-end rehab center. But after 62 days, he was pulled out by his father against the advice of the specialist. Ethan eventually pleaded guilty to 4 counts of intoxication manslaughter in a juvenile court. In December 2013, there was a sentencing hearing. The prosecutor wanted Ethan to be given the maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. Dr. Dick Miller, the psychiatrist who treated Ethan and his parents after the crash, testified on Ethan's behalf. He claimed that Ethan was so spoiled and coddled by his parents, he didn't understand the consequences of his actions. He said instead of teaching Ethan the golden rule, his parents taught him, "We have the gold, we make the rules." He said that Ethan suffered from affluenza, which was a term first used in the 1950s. Dr. Miller was paid over $15,000 to testify on Ethan's behalf. After 3 days of testimony, the judge decided to give Ethan no jail time. Instead, Ethan was ordered to go to a cushy rehabilitation center that his father would pay for. He was given 10 years of probation. The sentence made international headlines. To say that people were outraged over the sentence would be an understatement. As D Magazine put it, this was the son of a well-off family escaping consequences by saying he always avoided consequences. Many people thought it was the perfect example of how there are at least two justice systems in America, one for the rich and one for the poor. Also, if Ethan wasn't responsible because of his upbringing, shouldn't his parents be punished then? Morally, this may seem logical, but they actually hadn't broken any laws by raising a spoiled kid. Since Ethan was driving his father's truck at the time of the crash, the victim's family sued Ethan, his family, and his father's business. All the cases were settled out of court for undisclosed sums. Ethan's father's business is still in operation at the time of this video. Fred and Tanya split up shortly after Ethan killed 4 people and paralyzed a 5th. The Couch family has continually gotten into trouble since the collision. In early December 2015, someone posted on Twitter a 6-second video of Ethan playing beer pong. The Twitter user tagged the city of Burleson and the county's district attorney. He wrote, "Your boy Ethan Couch violating probation. I got more if you want." His probation officer went to investigate and he discovered Ethan was gone. It turned out that he and his mother had a small farewell party and then they vanished. A few weeks later, they were tracked to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. They were found because one of them had used their cell phone to order pizza from Domino's. When they were arrested, it was clear that they had tried to change their appearances. In April 2016, Ethan was sentenced to 2 years in jail. He was released sometime in 2018. In January 2020, Ethan was arrested again because THC was found in his system, which was a violation of his parole. However, he was released a few days later. That was because the results were weak positive. Ethan Couch will be on parole until 2024. Until then, he is not allowed to drink, do drugs, or drive. For years, Tanya has been trying to get the case against her for hindering the apprehension of a felon dismissed. She has been in and out of jail while awaiting trial for violating the conditions of her bond. Fred Couch has had several run-ins with the law after the deadly crash. In September 2014, Fred had witnessed a disturbance and several police officers responded to the scene. Fred told an officer that he was a reserve police officer with the Lakeside Police Department. He said that his police gear was in his car. He then showed the officer a badge. Later that night, the officer talked to a Lakeside police officer who was at the scene. He said he didn't know Fred. So they followed up and discovered that Fred wasn't in law enforcement and the badge was fake. He was charged with impersonating a police officer. In December 2016, Fred was sentenced to a year of probation. In August 2018, Fred was arrested for felony family violence. He supposedly choked his girlfriend. In December 2019, the grand jury chose not to indict, so the charges against him were dropped. Fred Couch has stayed out of the news ever since then. Number 2. Joseph Gray. In the summer of 2001, Joseph Gray was a police officer with the 72nd Precinct in Brooklyn, New York. He had been an officer with the New York Police Department for over 15 years. On the morning of August 4, 2001, Gray finished an overnight shift. Afterward, he and several officers who had worked the overnight shift hung out in a parking lot across the street from the precinct. For 2.5 hours, the officers, including a sergeant, drank beers. Then some of the officers left. Gray could have gone home to his wife and kids. Instead, he continued drinking. Around 2:30 that afternoon, Gray and 4 other officers made their way to a topless bar called the Wild Wild West that was a few blocks from the precinct. Gray and the other officers weren't supposed to go to the strip club. It was considered off limits to avoid any conflict of interest. Gray stayed at the bar until about 8:30 p.m. He had been steadily drinking for about 12 hours at this point. He had somewhere between 12 and 18 beers. He then got into his minivan. He was heading to Staten Island to pick up a colleague. But then he realized he had forgotten his cell phone at the bar. So he turned around and drove back towards the strip club. He was driving at least 30 miles per hour in a 15 miles per hour zone. At the intersection, 24-year-old Maria Herrera was crossing the road with her 4-year-old son, Andy, and her 16-year-old sister, Delicia Pena. Maria was 8 months pregnant. Joseph Gray, the 40-year-old off-duty police officer, blew the red light and plowed his minivan into the family. Afterward, he pulled over, but he didn't realize he had struck the family. A witness kept asking him what he did and grabbed him by the arm. Gray then saw 4-year-old Andy on his bumper, and it dawned on him that he was in big trouble. 911 was called. While waiting for first responders, Gray said to a witness, "Come on, man, we all have a few beers once in a while." He then blamed the victims for being run over. He kept saying, "Why did they cross?" Gray never acknowledged that he was in the wrong because he ran the red light. Maria was rushed to the hospital and her baby was delivered via cesarean section. He was named Ricardo Herrera. Tragically, Ricardo died 12 hours after he was born. Maria, her son Andy, and her sister, Delicia, all died due to their injuries. Joseph Gray was arrested by members of his own precinct. He had a blood alcohol level of 0.23, which is nearly 3 times the legal limit. There were some significant problems with the investigation from the start. For example, the accident report was not filled out correctly. Also, several photos of the crash scene turned out to be blank. Gray was released on bail the next day, much to the anger of Maria's husband, Victor, and many people in New York. Gray also kept his job, but he was placed on unpaid leave. He ended up quitting 3 weeks after the deadly collision. Joseph Gray went to trial in February 2002. The prosecution said that the police didn't cooperate with the investigation. The police chemist was supposed to hand over all evidence on Gray's blood work, but 60 pages were missing. The prosecution said that other evidence was temporarily displaced. One officer testified that a representative from the police union asked him what blood alcohol test Gray could beat. The defense blamed the victims and said that they shouldn't have been crossing the road. But several witnesses testified and they said that Gray blew the red light. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Then the jury deliberated for 3 hours. Joseph Gray was found guilty on 4 counts of second-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to the maximum 4 concurrent sentences of 5 to 15 years in prison. He'd be eligible for parole after 5 years. After the trial, there was an investigation of the precinct. One investigator, who had retired, admitted that he tried to give Gray the benefit because he was a police officer. 17 officers ended up being disciplined. 5 were transferred, 3 were suspended, and 2 were fired. Many people consider the case to be an example of the blue wall of silence. The blue wall of silence is that some police officers will not report on their fellow officers' errors, crimes, or misdeeds. In some cases, evidence can be planted or lost or tampered with to benefit the police. Officers will also perjure themselves to honor the code of silence. In 2006, Joseph Gray did a jailhouse interview with ABC News. He admitted he had at least 12 beers that day. He said he didn't hesitate before getting behind the wheel, but he admitted that he probably shouldn't have driven. He also said that his reflexes weren't as sharp as they could have been, but he said his reflexes weren't the problem. He said that he was in total control. He said that he had driven after 3 or 4 beers before and never had a problem. He never took responsibility for the collision. He blamed the family, saying that they had crossed against the light. However, several witnesses said that Gray drove through the red light. Also, Gray had no idea he ran over the family, so he was probably not the most reliable witness at the scene. Joseph Gray applied for parole 3 times, and he was denied each time. In February 2011, when he was denied for the 3rd time, the parole board said there was reasonable probability that he would violate the law again. They also said that releasing him would be incompatible with the welfare and safety of the community. Gray said that the media and the parole board weren't treating him fairly. Joseph Gray was released in April 2012 when he was 51 years old. He had served about 10 years in prison for killing a woman and 3 children. Gray has stayed out of the news since then, and his current whereabouts are unknown. Number 1. Larry Mahoney. In spring 1988, Larry Wayne Mahoney was 34 years old, and he worked as a chemical operator at M&T Chemicals Incorporated in Carrollton, Kentucky. Many people described him as an easygoing country boy who liked to hunt and drive pickup trucks. He was considered smart and he got A's in school, but he dropped out in his sophomore year. Mahoney was known to drink on occasion, but he wasn't considered an alcoholic. When he did drink, he drank a lot. In 1984, Mahoney was convicted of drinking and driving. He was fined $300 and his license was suspended for 6 months. He also had convictions in 1980 and 1983 for disorderly conduct, but it's not known if alcohol was involved. Many people who knew Mahoney said he was funny and he wouldn't hurt anyone on purpose. On the morning of May 14, 1988, Mahoney finished a 12-hour shift at his plant. That afternoon, he went over to a friend's home. He ate some pizza and had at least 2 beers. He then went to another friend's home where he consumed vodka. Mahoney left his friend's home and picked up a 12-pack of Miller Lite. Earlier that morning, before Mahoney got off work, 67 people boarded a school bus that belonged to the Assembly of God Church in Radcliffe, Kentucky. On the bus was the church's youth group, their guests, 4 chaperones, and a driver, who was also the church's associate pastor. They were heading from Radcliffe to Kings Island, which is a theme park in Mason, Ohio. The group spent the day at the park, and then they started the 175-mile trip back to Radcliffe. At 10:55 p.m., the bus was heading south on Interstate 71, just outside of Carrollton, Kentucky. They were about 90 miles from Radcliffe. Suddenly, the bus collided head-on with a 1987 Toyota pickup truck driven by 34-year-old Larry Mahoney. Mahoney was driving on the interstate in the wrong direction. No one on the bus was seriously injured in the crash. But, tragically, the crash was just the start of their problems. The collision severed the bus's fuel tank, and moments later, the front of the bus burst into flames. The 36-year-old driver of the bus, John Perriman, tried to put out the fire with an extinguisher. Unfortunately, the fire was too intense, and the extinguisher was too small to contain the fire. The bus only had one emergency exit, and that was the back door. There was a rush for the back door, and this caused a pileup. Dozens of people ended up being stuck on the burning bus. The fire and the smoke killed 27 people on the bus, including the bus driver. 24 of them were children, who ranged in age from 10 to 17. Most of the victims were 13 or 14 years old. Another 34 people were injured. Out of the 67 people on the bus, only 6 escaped without serious injury. Several survivors have horrifying accounts of what it was like on the burning bus. One that really stands out is 14-year-old Harold Dennis. His face was burned, and he suffered third-degree burns on his back and his shoulders. He was pulled from the bus, and he was laid on the grass on the median. He said that it felt like every blade of grass was a knife sticking him. For weeks after the crash, Harold's family wouldn't let him look in a mirror. When Harold saw his face for the first time after the crash, he started screaming. Of course, Larry Mahoney survived the crash without any serious injuries. In Mahoney's truck, the police found the 12-pack of beer, which was still cold. Several beers from the case were missing. His blood alcohol level was 0.24, which was twice the legal limit. He was charged with 27 counts of capital murder. The prosecutor was seeking the death penalty. Larry Mahoney's community rallied behind him and supported him. They raised money for his bail. One person said that it could have happened to anyone, and a lot of people get behind the wheel after drinking too much. Larry Mahoney went to trial in December 1989. The prosecution was able to prove that he had 7 beers that night, plus the vodka. Experts believed he probably had closer to 24 beers. Mahoney's defense lawyer said that Mahoney had been tricked into drinking the vodka. They said he had drank a clear liquid, which he thought was water. But Mahoney's friend testified, and he said that Mahoney asked for the drink, and he knew it was vodka. Larry Mahoney testified, and he admitted to drinking 7 beers that night, but he said nothing about the vodka. He also apologized to the families, but he acknowledged that his apology might not change their feelings about him. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. Larry Mahoney was acquitted on all the murder counts, but he was found guilty of 27 counts of second-degree manslaughter. The jury recommended that he be sentenced to 16 years in prison, and the judge agreed. Many of the victims' families were upset by the verdict and the sentence. They felt that too many people had sympathized with Mahoney and what he would have to deal with the rest of his life. Meanwhile, many of them were dealing with the fact that their friends and family members, many of whom were only teens, had died while trapped on a burning school bus. Larry Mahoney was a model prisoner, so time was taken off his sentence. He was released in 1999 after serving 11 years. After getting out of jail, Mahoney got a job, got married, and settled on some land in Owen County, Kentucky, where he still lives today. Since being released, Mahoney has refused all requests for interviews, and he hasn't publicly spoken about the collision. Survivor Harold Dennis wanted to interview him for the 2013 documentary After the Crash. but Mahoney declined the invitation. Many people believe that this only adds to the tragedy because they think that Mahoney would be a powerful advocate against drinking and driving. Mahoney's friends and family said he just wants to be left alone. At the time of this video, he is 69 years old. Harold Dennis went on to play wide receiver for the University of Kentucky. He got married and he is the father of 3 children. Like many of the other survivors of the crash, he is an advocate against impaired driving. The crash led to several changes on school buses. School buses are now required to have at least 2 emergency exits and the fuel tanks are better protected. The Carrollton bus collision is the deadliest drunk driving crash in American history. Everyone agrees that it was an immense tragedy. But it could have been avoided had Larry Mahoney not driven while he was drunk. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to check out the latest episode of our podcast, Into the Killing. In this episode, we discuss 2 cold cases that were solved with an amazing forensic tool. You can find Into the Killing on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.